The gunshot that killed Sarah Everett still echoed in Thomas Everett's dreams 3 years later, and he hadn't found a single reason to smile since the day they buried her outside Laredo, Texas, in the scorching summer of 1873. Thomas stood on the porch of his ranch house in the early morning light, watching the sun bleed red across the horizon like an open wound. The cattle lowed in the distance, and his foreman Miguel was already moving among them, checking the water troughs in the relentless heat that had plagued southern Texas for weeks. The land stretched out before him, thousands of acres of scrub brush and hardy grass that somehow sustained his herd despite the punishing climate. He owned one of the largest ranches in Webb County, built it with his own hands and Sarah's unwavering support, but the success felt hollow now, like biting into fruit only to find it rotten at the core. He was 31 years old and felt ancient. Sarah had been loading supplies into their wagon outside the general store when a dispute between two drunken cowboys had turned violent. She wasn't even part of it, just standing in the wrong place when bullets started flying. One shot, straight through her heart, and she was gone before Thomas could reach her side. The sheriff had arrested both men and they'd hanged within a month, but it didn't bring her back. Nothing would bring her back. Thomas descended the porch steps and headed toward the barn, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. The drought had been merciless this year, and he'd had to drive some of his cattle further north to better grazing land, leaving him with a skeleton crew to manage the main ranch. He didn't mind the extra work. It kept his hands busy and his mind occupied, though nothing could truly silence the grief that sat like a stone in his chest. He was checking the hinges on one of the stall doors when he heard the commotion outside. Raised voices, one of them distinctly female, and Miguel's patient tone trying to mediate. Thomas frowned and walked back into the sunlight, squinting against the glare. A woman stood near the ranch gate, her dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, her simple cotton dress dusty from travel. She held a rope in both hands, and at the other end of that rope was the most stubborn-looking goat Thomas had ever seen. The creature had planted all 4 hooves in the dirt and refused to budge, its rectangular pupils fixed on Miguel with an expression of pure defiance. "I am telling you, Senorita, Mr. Everett does not buy goats," Miguel was saying, his hands spread in a gesture of helplessness. "We run cattle here, only cattle." "I'm not trying to sell him a goat," the woman replied, exasperation clear in her voice. She tugged on the rope, but the goat might as well have been made of granite. "I'm looking for work, and Chester here comes with me. That's the deal." "Chester?" Miguel glanced at the goat with obvious skepticism. "What's going on here?" Thomas called out, striding toward them. The woman turned to face him, and Thomas found himself looking into the most startling green eyes he'd ever seen. They reminded him of the rare grass that sprouted after heavy rains, vibrant and alive in a landscape of browns and grays. She was young, probably in her early 20s, with a determined set to her jaw and sun-browned skin that spoke of a life spent outdoors. "Are you Thomas Everett?" she asked directly. "I am. My name is Tabitha Nelson. I'm looking for ranch work, and I heard in town that you might be hiring." Thomas crossed his arms over his chest. "Who told you that?" The man at the feed store. "He said you'd sent some of your herd north and were short-handed." She met his gaze without flinching, which was more than most men did these days. Thomas knew his reputation in Laredo had become something of a local legend, the grieving widower who never smiled, never socialized, just worked his ranch with single-minded intensity. "Even if that were true, I don't hire women," Thomas said flatly. Tabitha's eyes flashed. "Why not?" "I can ride, rope, mend fences, tend animals, and work harder than most men you'd find in any saloon in town. I don't drink, I don't gamble, and I show up when I say I will." And the goat, at that moment, as if on cue, Chester decided he'd had enough of standing still. He suddenly lunged forward, jerking the rope from Tabitha's hands, and made a beeline straight for Thomas. Before anyone could react, the goat had lowered his head and butted directly into Thomas's thigh, not hard enough to injure but with enough force to make the tall rancher stumble backward in surprise. "Chester, no!" Tabitha shouted, rushing forward to grab the trailing rope. But Chester wasn't finished. He circled around Thomas, eyeing him with what could only be described as suspicious disdain, then proceeded to urinate on Thomas's boot. Miguel gasped. Tabitha froze, her face going pale. And Thomas looked down at his soaked boot, at the unrepentant goat now chewing on the end of his own rope, and felt something crack inside his chest. It started as a cough, or maybe a choking sound. Then it bubbled up from somewhere deep in his gut, somewhere he'd thought had died along with Sarah. His shoulders shook, his face contorted, and then, to his own absolute shock, Thomas Everett laughed. It wasn't a polite chuckle or a restrained snort. It was a full, genuine laugh that burst out of him like water from a broken dam. He laughed at the absurdity of it, at the goat's audacious behavior, at the horrified expression on Tabitha's face, at the fact that this was the most ridiculous thing that had happened to him in 3 years of carefully controlled monotony. Miguel stared at him as if he'd witnessed a miracle. Tabitha's mouth hung open in confusion, still clutching Chester's rope. "I am so sorry," she finally managed. "Chester has boundary issues. I'll pay for cleaning your boot." Thomas held up a hand, still chuckling, wiping his eyes with the other. "That's the most personality anyone's shown me in years, and I'm including the humans." "Does this mean I'm not getting the job?" Tabitha asked quietly. Thomas looked at her, really looked at her this time. There were shadows under those green eyes, the kind that spoke of hard times and harder choices. Her dress had been mended multiple times, and her boots were worn thin at the soles. Whatever had brought her to his ranch, desperate enough to demand work with a goat in tow, it wasn't good circumstances. "You got experience with cattle?" he asked. "I grew up on a ranch outside San Antonio. Worked it with my father until he died 2 years ago." "What happened to the ranch?" Her jaw tightened. "Banker called in the loans, sold everything to cover the debts. And you've been doing what since then? Whatever work I could find, cooking, cleaning, laundry. But I'm a rancher, Mr. Everett, not a housemaid. I want to do what I'm good at." Thomas glanced at Miguel, who shrugged as if to say the decision was his to make. He looked back at Tabitha, at the pride in her bearing despite her obvious poverty, at the stubborn set of her shoulders that matched the stubborn goat standing beside her. "I'll give you a trial period," he said finally. 2 weeks. You'll work alongside Miguel and the other hands, same pay as them, same hours. You'll bunk in the small cabin behind the barn. If you can keep up and prove your worth, the job's yours permanent. Relief flooded Tabitha's face. "Thank you, Mr. Everett. You won't regret this." "And the goat?" Miguel asked weakly. "Chester stays in the cabin with me," Tabitha said quickly. "He won't bother the cattle. He's actually very well behaved most of the time." Thomas looked at his wet boot. "Evidence suggests otherwise, but fine. Just keep him away from me." Tabitha nodded vigorously, already leading Chester toward the cabin Miguel was pointing out. Thomas watched her go, aware that something fundamental had just shifted in his carefully ordered world. He'd laughed. For the first time since Sarah's death, something had broken through the wall of grief and made him laugh. It felt like betrayal and relief all at once. The next morning, Thomas woke before dawn as always, dressed in the darkness, and made his way to the kitchen. He'd grown accustomed to making his own coffee, his own simple meals. The house felt too big for one person, but he couldn't bring himself to sell it, not when he and Sarah had planned every room together, chosen every piece of furniture. He was surprised to find lamplight already glowing in the kitchen window. When he entered, Tabitha stood at the stove, cooking what smelled like bacon and eggs. "What are you doing in my house?" Thomas asked, his voice coming out harsher than he intended. Tabitha didn't flinch. "Making breakfast. The cabin doesn't have a proper stove, and I figured since I'm up anyway, I might as well cook for both of us. You can deduct it from my pay if you want. I didn't hire you to cook. You didn't hire me not to cook either." She turned to face him, spatula in hand. "Look, Mr. Everett, I learned a long time ago that in order to keep a job, you have to make yourself indispensable. So yes, I'll work the ranch, but I'll also cook and clean and do whatever else needs doing. That's just who I am." Thomas wanted to argue, wanted to maintain the boundaries he'd carefully constructed around his life, but the smell of real food was making his stomach growl. He'd been living on hardtack and jerky for too long. "Fine," he muttered, sitting down at the table. "But this doesn't become an expectation. Understood?" She brought over 2 plates, each piled with perfectly cooked eggs, crispy bacon, and toasted bread. It was the best meal Thomas had eaten in months. They ate in silence for a while. Then Tabitha said, "Miguel told me about your wife." "I'm sorry for your loss." Thomas's fork froze halfway to his mouth. "I don't talk about that. I wasn't asking you to, I was just offering sympathy." She took a sip of coffee. "My mother died when I was 12, cholera, then my father 2 years ago. Heart just gave out one day while he was mending a fence, so I understand loss." Despite himself, Thomas felt some of the tension leave his shoulders. "It doesn't get easier." "No," Tabitha agreed softly, "but it does get different. The sharp edges wear down a little." They finished breakfast without further conversation, but something had been established between them, a mutual recognition of grief that didn't require elaborate explanation. As promised, Tabitha proved herself capable from day one. She could rope a steer as well as any of the hands, sat a horse like she'd been born in the saddle, and wasn't afraid of hard physical labor in the brutal Texas heat. The men were skeptical at first, but by the end of the first week, even the most doubtful among them had to admit she earned her place. Chester, surprisingly, became something of a ranch mascot. The goat had an uncanny ability to escape from any enclosure, which led to him showing up in the most unexpected places. Thomas found him one morning standing on the roof of the chicken coop, surveying his domain like a furry king. Another time, Chester managed to get into the feed shed and ate half a bag of oats before anyone noticed. But it was the incident with the rattlesnake that changed everything. Thomas had been checking the fence line in the far eastern pasture, alone as he preferred to work. He'd been so focused on examining a broken post that he didn't notice the coiled rattlesnake until he was about to step on it. The snake's warning rattle filled the air, and Thomas froze, his hand instinctively going to the pistol at his hip. Before he could draw, a gray blur shot past him. Chester, who had apparently followed Thomas out to the pasture, charged the snake with a fearlessness that bordered on insanity. The goat reared up and brought his hooves down on the snake repeatedly, dancing away from its strikes with surprising agility, until the reptile lay motionless in the dust. Thomas stood there, heart pounding, staring at the dead snake and then at the goat. Chester looked up at him with those strange rectangular pupils, made a satisfied bleating sound, and trotted away as if he'd done nothing more extraordinary than eat some grass. That evening, Thomas found Tabitha in the barn, checking on a mare that was due to foal soon. He leaned against the stall door, watching her gentle hands examine the horse with practiced care. "Your goat saved my life today," he said without preamble. Tabitha looked up, concern immediate in her eyes. What happened? He told her about the rattlesnake. She listened quietly, her hand stilling on the mare's flank. Chester's killed 3 snakes since we've been traveling together, she said when he finished. Goats are natural enemies of snakes. I think he sees it as his job to protect his herd. His herd being us, she smiled, and Thomas noticed for the first time how it transformed her face, softening the hard edges that life had carved there. I suppose so. He's adopted you, Mr. Everett. That's why he marked you that first day. By urinating on my boot, it's a goat thing, claiming territory. Thomas found himself almost smiling. I've been claimed by a goat. What's my life become? Could be worse. Could be a skunk. This time he did smile just a little and saw her notice it. Something flickered in her eyes, something warm and complicated before she turned back to the mare. This girl's going to foal within the next day or two, Tabitha said, changing the subject. Someone should stay with her. I'll do it, Thomas said. I can help. 4 eyes are better than 2. They ended up both staying, taking turns napping on hay bales while the other kept watch. In the quiet hours of the night, with only lamplight and the soft sounds of horses around them, they began to talk. Really talk, in a way Thomas hadn't with another person since Sarah died. Tabitha told him about growing up on her father's ranch, about learning to rope and ride before she could read. She talked about the heartbreak of losing her mother, and then the crushing blow of losing her father and the ranch all at once. There was a man, she said quietly, staring at the lantern flame. A banker's son from San Antonio. He'd been courting me for about 6 months. Said he loved me, said he wanted to marry me. Then my father died and the debts came due, and suddenly he didn't know me anymore. His father bought our ranch for a fraction of what it was worth, and the son married a girl whose family owned a hotel. I'm sorry, Thomas said, and meant it. I learned something important then. Love isn't what people say, it's what they do. Words are cheap. Actions are what count. Thomas thought about Sarah, about how she'd worked beside him every day to build the ranch, never complaining about the heat or the isolation or the hard work. About how she'd loved him with her whole heart, no reservations, no conditions. My wife was like that, he heard himself say. She loved with her whole self. When she died, it felt like someone had cut off my arm, like a fundamental part of me was just gone. How did you survive it? Tabitha asked softly. I'm not sure I did. I think I've just been going through the motions, waiting to feel something again. He paused. Until yesterday, when your goat urinated on my boot. Tabitha laughed, the sound bright and unexpected in the quiet barn. I still can't believe that made you laugh. Neither can I, but it did. He looked at her across the lamp-lit space. You did. Their eyes met and held for a long moment. Thomas felt something stir in his chest, something he'd thought dead and buried. It wasn't the same as what he'd felt with Sarah, that couldn't be replicated, but it was real and warm and alive. The mare chose that moment to go into labor, breaking the tension. For the next 2 hours, they worked together to help bring a healthy colt into the world. Tabitha's hands were steady and sure, her voice calm as she talked the mare through the difficult parts. Thomas found himself watching her as much as the horse, noticing the concentration on her face, the gentle competence of her movements. When the colt finally stood on wobbly legs and began to nurse, they both sat back in exhausted satisfaction. That never gets old, Tabitha said, smiling at the new life they'd helped bring into the world. No, Thomas agreed. It doesn't. The 2 weeks of trial period came and went. Thomas made Tabitha's position permanent without even having to think about it. She'd become essential to the ranch's operation, but more than that, she'd become essential to him in ways he was only beginning to understand. The other ranch hands noticed the change in their boss. Miguel commented to Tabitha one day that he hadn't seen Mr. Everett this alive in 3 years. The walls he'd built around himself were coming down, brick by brick, and Tabitha seemed to be the only one with the key to dismantle them. But Thomas was still afraid. Afraid of betraying Sarah's memory. Afraid of opening himself up to that kind of loss again. Afraid that what he was beginning to feel for Tabitha was too soon, too fast, too much. He tried to maintain distance, tried to keep things professional, but it was like trying to hold back a river with his bare hands. Tabitha was everywhere in the barn, at the breakfast table, riding beside him across the range. Her laughter had become a sound he looked forward to. Her opinions something he actively sought out. Her presence something that made the big, empty ranch house feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. One particularly hot afternoon in late August, Thomas was working to repair a section of fence near the creek when he heard a splash and a very unladylike curse. He looked up to find Tabitha sitting in the shallow water, her horse standing on the bank looking apologetic. "He spooked at a rabbit and I wasn't paying attention," she called out, sounding more annoyed at herself than anything. Thomas walked over, extending a hand to help her up. The water had soaked through her dress, and she was covered in mud from the creek bed. She should have looked ridiculous, but all Thomas could see was the way the sun caught in her wet hair, turning it to dark gold, and how her eyes sparkled with embarrassed laughter. "I must look a sight," she said, accepting his hand and climbing up the bank. "You look beautiful," Thomas said, and then froze, realizing he'd spoken the thought out loud. Tabitha stilled, water dripping from her dress, her hand still in his. "Thomas," she said softly, and it was the first time she'd used his given name. "I didn't mean to say that," he backtracked quickly, releasing her hand and stepping away. "I apologize. That was inappropriate." "Was it true?" she asked, not moving, not letting him escape. He looked at her, at this woman who'd blown into his life with her stubborn goat and her capable hands and her understanding of grief, and couldn't lie. "Yes." "Then why apologize?" "Because I'm not ready. Because I don't know if I'll ever be ready." "Because Sarah is dead," Tabitha said gently but firmly. "And I'm not her, Thomas. I'm not trying to replace her or make you forget her. But you're not dead, even if you've been acting like it for 3 years. "It's only been 3 years, he protested weakly. "And how many more years do you plan to waste? 4, 5, 20? Are you going to punish yourself for surviving her for the rest of your life?" The words hit him like a physical blow because they were true. He had been punishing himself, had been living in a kind of self-imposed purgatory where he was forbidden from feeling anything good because Sarah couldn't feel anything at all anymore. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice rough with emotion. Tabitha stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the creek water and the sunshine on her skin. "Neither do I. But maybe we can figure it out together." She waited, giving him the choice, giving him the space to step back if he needed to. But Thomas found he didn't want to step back. For the first time in 3 years, he wanted to step forward. He cupped her face in his work-roughened hands and kissed her, gentle and tentative, like a man learning a language he'd thought forgotten. She kissed him back with equal gentleness, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, right over his heart. When they finally pulled apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. "I'm still scared," he whispered. "That's okay," she whispered back. "So am I." They stood there by the creek, holding each other in the Texas heat, while Tabitha's horse cropped grass nearby and Chester, who had wandered over to investigate, watched them with his inscrutable goat expression. Things changed between them after that day, but not in the way Thomas had feared. They didn't rush into anything, didn't make grand declarations or dramatic gestures. Instead, they moved toward each other in small, careful increments, like two wounded animals learning to trust again. Tabitha continued to stay in the cabin, but she spent more evenings on the main house porch, sitting beside Thomas as they watched the sun set over the ranch. They talked about everything and nothing, sharing the stories of their lives, weaving their separate histories into a shared present. Thomas told her about building the ranch with Sarah, about their dreams of filling the house with children, about the guilt he felt at surviving when she hadn't. Tabitha listened without judgment, understanding that she wasn't in competition with a ghost, that Sarah would always be a part of Thomas's story. In turn, Tabitha shared more about her own losses, about the bitterness of betrayal by the man she'd thought would marry her, about the fear and uncertainty of the past 2 years. She told Thomas about the odd jobs she'd taken, some of them barely respectable, all of them necessary for survival. She told him about finding Chester at an auction, spending the last of her savings to buy him because something in the goat's stubborn demeanor had reminded her of herself. "He was the only thing that was truly mine," she said one evening, Chester lying at her feet like an unusual guard dog. "Everything else had been taken or lost, but Chester was mine." "I'm glad you bought him," Thomas said. "Otherwise you might never have come here." "Do you ever wonder if things happen for a reason?" Tabitha asked, looking out at the darkening sky. "If my father was meant to die so I'd lose the ranch, so I'd end up in Laredo, so I'd hear about a job here." "I don't know about meant to," Thomas said carefully. "But I think sometimes terrible things lead to unexpected places. Sarah died, and it was the worst thing that ever happened to me. But if she hadn't died, you wouldn't be here right now. And I can't quite bring myself to wish that." Tabitha reached over and took his hand. They sat like that as the stars came out, just holding hands, taking comfort in the simple fact of each other's presence. September arrived with slightly cooler temperatures and the constant work of preparing for the fall cattle drive. Thomas would be taking a portion of his herd north to market, a journey that would take several weeks. In past years, he'd looked forward to the drive as an escape from the emptiness of the ranch house. This year, he found himself reluctant to leave. "Come with me," he said to Tabitha one morning over breakfast. She looked up from her eggs in surprise. "On the drive? Why not?" "You're as good a hand as any of the men, better than some. I could use you." "What about Chester? Bring him. He's proven himself useful with the snakes." Tabitha grinned. "Are you sure that's the only reason you want me to come?" Thomas felt his ears heat, which seemed to delight her. "It's a primary reason." "What are the other reasons?" He met her eyes across the table. "Because I don't want to be away from you for 3 weeks, because you make everything better. Because I think I'm falling in love with you, and I'm terrified, and I need you to be patient with me while I figure out what that means." The grin faded from Tabitha's face, replaced by something softer and more vulnerable. "I think I'm falling in love with you too," she said quietly. "And I'm just as terrified, so we'll be terrified together." The cattle drive left on a Monday morning, 1,500 head of cattle and 8 riders, including Thomas and Tabitha. Chester trotted along beside Tabitha's horse like he'd been born to the trail, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting smells or chase away snakes. The drive was hard work, dusty and exhausting, with long days in the saddle and short nights camping under the stars. But Thomas found himself enjoying it in a way he hadn't in years. Having Tabitha riding beside him, working alongside him, made all the difference. They talked as they rode, sometimes about serious things, sometimes about nothing at all. She told him stories about growing up, about the time she tried to ride a bull on a dare and broken her arm, about learning to shoot from her father and becoming a better marksman than most men. He told her about his childhood in Tennessee, about coming to Texas as a young man seeking his fortune, about meeting Sarah at a church social and knowing immediately that she was the one. "Tell me about her," Tabitha said one day as they rode behind the herd. Thomas tensed. "Why?" "Because she was important to you. Because she helped make you who you are. I want to understand all of you, Thomas, not just the parts that came after she died." So he told her. He told her about Sarah's laugh, about how she could make friends with anyone, about her terrible cooking when they first got married, and how she'd worked to get better. He told her about lazy Sunday mornings and hard times they'd weathered together, and the dreams they'd shared. "She sounds wonderful," Tabitha said when he finished, and there was no jealousy in her voice, just genuine appreciation for the woman who'd loved Thomas first. She was. "But she's gone, and you're here, and I'm starting to believe that both of those things can be true without diminishing either of you." Tabitha reached across the space between their horses and squeezed his hand. "I love you," she said simply. Thomas felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I love you too." They didn't kiss, not there in front of the other hands, but the declaration hung between them like a promise. That night, after the herd had been settled and the men were asleep around the campfire, Thomas and Tabitha walked out into the darkness together. The prairie stretched endlessly in all directions, lit only by starlight and a thin crescent moon. "It's beautiful out here," Tabitha said softly. "So much space, so much sky." "Reminds me of how small we are," Thomas said, "how brief our time is. All the more reason not to waste it." Thomas turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "Tabitha Nelson, I know this is fast, and I know we're still figuring things out, but I also know I don't want to spend another day without knowing you're mine and I'm yours. Will you marry me?" Tabitha's eyes widened in the starlight. "Thomas, are you sure? It's only been a few months." "I wasted 3 years being sure I'd never feel anything again. I don't want to waste any more time. But if you need to wait, if you need more time, I'll give you that." "I don't need more time," Tabitha said, and her voice was shaking. "I just needed to know you were really ready, that you really wanted this and weren't just lonely." "I was lonely," Thomas admitted. "But that's not why I love you. I love you because you're stubborn and strong and kind. I love you because you make me laugh. I love you because you see the broken parts of me and don't try to fix them. You just accept them as part of who I am. I love you because when I think about the future, I can't picture it without you in it." Tears were streaming down Tabitha's face now, catching the starlight. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." Thomas pulled her into his arms and kissed her properly this time, with all the emotion and longing and hope he'd been holding back. She kissed him back with equal fervor, her arms wrapping around his neck, holding him like she'd never let go. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and grinning, a loud, bleating sound interrupted the moment. They turned to find Chester standing a few feet away, watching them with what seemed like approval. "I think he's giving us his blessing," Tabitha said, laughing. "Well, I did ask for the goat's hoof in marriage," Thomas said seriously. "It's only proper." Tabitha burst into laughter, bright and joyous, and Thomas couldn't help but join her. They stood there in the darkness, laughing like fools, with a goat as their only witness, and Thomas felt more alive than he had in 3 years. The rest of the cattle drive passed in a blur of happiness. The other hands noticed the change between their boss and Tabitha. And while there might have been some initial awkwardness, Miguel shut down any potential gossip with a stern look and a reminder that Mr. Everett's private business was his own. They reached the railhead in Dodge City on a Tuesday afternoon, the cattle dusty and tired, but in good condition. Thomas got a fair price for the herd, better than he'd hoped given the market conditions. With the money secured and the cattle loaded onto rail cars bound for Chicago, the drive crew prepared for the journey home. Thomas took Tabitha into town before they left, to a small jewelry shop run by an elderly German immigrant. There he bought her a simple gold ring, all he could afford at the moment, but she looked at it like it was made of diamonds. "It's perfect," she said, slipping it onto her finger. "Absolutely perfect." They were married in Lerdo on a Saturday in October, in the small church where Thomas had attended services with Sarah. He'd agonized over whether it was appropriate, whether it felt like a betrayal. But the new minister, a young man who'd only been in town a year, had assured him that love was never wrong, that moving forward with life was what the dead would want for those they'd loved. Tabitha wore a simple white dress that she'd sewn herself, with wildflowers in her hair. Thomas wore his best suit, cleaned and pressed for the occasion. Miguel stood up as his best man, and the wife of one of the other ranch hands served as Tabitha's attendant. Chester, to everyone's amusement, was allowed to sit in the front pew, wearing a ribbon around his neck. The ceremony was simple and brief. Thomas's voice shook when he said his vows, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment, by the fact that he was standing here promising forever to another woman, something he'd never imagined doing again. But when he looked into Tabitha's eyes and saw the love and understanding there, the fear faded, replaced by certainty. "I, Thomas Everett, take you, Tabitha Nelson, to be my wife. I promise to love you, honor you, and stand by your side through whatever comes. I promise to see you for who you are, not who I need you to be. I promise to build a life with you that honors both our pasts and embraces our future. This I vow before God and these witnesses." Tabitha's vows were equally heartfelt, her voice steady and sure. "I, Tabitha Nelson, take you, Thomas Everett, to be my husband. I promise to love you in your joy and your sorrow, to be your partner in all things, to respect the love you've known before while building something new with you. I promise to stand by your side as we face whatever life brings, to laugh with you, cry with you, and grow old with you. This I vow, before God and these witnesses." When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, and invited Thomas to kiss his bride, Thomas cupped Tabitha's face in his hands, marveling at the miracle of this moment, and kissed her with all the love and gratitude in his heart. The small congregation applauded, Chester bleated loudly, and Thomas felt something shift in his chest, like a locked door finally swinging open. He was married again. He was beginning again. And Sarah, wherever she was, he hoped she understood. The reception was held at the ranch, with music and dancing and more food than seemed possible. The neighbors came, the ranch hands and their families, people from town who'd known Thomas for years. They ate barbecued beef and fresh bread and apple pies, and they danced under lanterns strung between the trees. Thomas danced with his bride, holding her close as Miguel played guitar and sang old Spanish love songs. He wasn't a particularly good dancer, but Tabitha didn't seem to mind, just rested her head on his shoulder and swayed with him to the music. "Happy," he murmured into her hair. "Happier than I ever thought I'd be," she replied. "You, same." He pulled back to look at her. "I never thought I'd feel this way again. Thank you for being patient with me, for giving me time to find my way back to life. Thank you for taking a chance on a woman with a stubborn goat," Tabitha said, smiling. "Best decision I ever made." As the evening wore on, and the guests began to leave, Thomas and Tabitha finally found themselves alone on the porch of what was now their house. The stars were brilliant overhead, the night air was cool and pleasant, and somewhere in the darkness, Chester was probably getting into something he shouldn't. "I have something for you," Thomas said, pulling a folded paper from his jacket pocket. Tabitha took it curiously and unfolded it. In the lamplight, she read the words on the deed amendment, adding her name to the ranch ownership. Her breath caught. "Thomas, this is too much," she said. "No, it's not. This ranch is our home now, yours and mine together. I want it to be legally yours as much as it is mine. Partners in all things, remember?" Tabitha wiped at her eyes, smiling even as tears fell. "Partners in all things," she agreed. They went inside together, and Thomas led her upstairs to the bedroom. He'd changed the curtains, rearranged some furniture, trying to make it feel like a new space rather than a shrine to his past. Tabitha noticed and squeezed his hand in appreciation. "We don't have to," he said quietly. "If you need more time." "I don't need more time," Tabitha said, reaching up to cup his face. "I need you." They came together slowly, carefully, learning each other's bodies with gentle hands and patient kisses. Thomas had been afraid that it would feel wrong, that he'd be haunted by memories. But being with Tabitha felt entirely different from being with Sarah, unique and new and right in its own way. Afterward they lay tangled together in the sheets, Tabitha's head on Thomas's chest, his arm around her shoulders. "I love you," he said into the darkness. "I love you too," she replied. "And Thomas, she would have wanted this for you, you know. She would have wanted you to be happy." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes. "I think you're right. I think she would have liked you. I think I would have liked her too." They fell asleep like that, wrapped in each other and in the peace of finally having found their way home. The months that followed were among the happiest of Thomas's life. He and Tabitha settled into a rhythm of partnership that extended to every aspect of ranch life. They worked side by side during the day, ate meals together, spent evenings planning for the future. The other hands adjusted to having a woman as part owner of the ranch, and soon enough, they forgot there had ever been a time when she wasn't there. Chester continued to be both helpful and troublesome in equal measure. He saved Miguel from a rattlesnake, ate half a vegetable garden, fathered several offspring with goats from neighboring ranches, and once climbed onto the roof of the barn for reasons no one could explain. But he was loyal to Tabitha in a way that bordered on devotion, never straying far from her side when they were out on the range. As winter approached, bringing cooler temperatures and occasional rain that turned the brown landscape briefly green, Thomas noticed changes in Tabitha. She was tired more often, occasionally nauseated in the mornings, and there was a new softness to her face that made her even more beautiful. He didn't say anything, waiting for her to tell him in her own time. Finally, one evening in late December as they sat by the fire, she took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "There's someone you should meet," she said softly. Thomas's heart seemed to stop and then race double time. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. The doctor in town confirmed it yesterday. We're going to have a baby, Thomas." He pulled her into his arms, overwhelmed by emotion. He'd thought this dream had died with Sarah, that he'd never get to be a father, never get to hold his child. Now it was happening, and the joy was almost too much to bear. "I'm scared," he admitted. "What if something goes wrong? What if I lose you too?" Tabitha pulled back to look at him seriously. "You can't live your life afraid of what might happen. I could die in childbirth, that's true. Or I could live to be 80 and bore you to death with stories about the old days. But we can't control the future, Thomas. All we can do is love each other now in this moment and trust that it's enough." "It is enough," he said fiercely. "You're enough, more than enough." They spent the winter preparing, turning one of the spare bedrooms into a nursery, buying supplies in town, making plans for how they'd manage the ranch with a new baby. Thomas found himself simultaneously excited and terrified, constantly checking on Tabitha, worried about every little thing. "You're going to drive yourself crazy," Miguel told him one day, watching Thomas fret over Tabitha riding a horse at 5 months pregnant. "Women have been having babies forever. She's strong, she knows her limits. I know that, but I can't help worrying." "Worry is just fear with nowhere to go," Miguel said sagely. "Better to put that energy into preparing for what's coming rather than worrying about what might not happen." Thomas tried to take the advice to heart. He threw himself into fixing up the nursery, building a beautiful hand-carved cradle that took him weeks to complete. Tabitha caught him in there one afternoon, running his hand over the smooth wood. "It's beautiful," she said from the doorway. "I want everything to be perfect for him." "Or her," Thomas said. Tabitha walked into the room, her hand resting on her swollen belly. The baby had started moving recently, little flutters that made her smile. "It already is perfect because this baby will have you as a father. I don't know how to be a father. And I don't know how to be a mother. We'll figure it out together, just like we've figured out everything else." Spring arrived with wildflowers carpeting the prairie and new calves wobbling on stick-thin legs. The ranch was thriving under Thomas and Tabitha's joint stewardship, doing better than it had in years. They'd hired 2 more hands, young men fresh from farms back east, eager to learn the cattle business. Tabitha continued working as long as she could, but by late May, her belly had grown too large for comfortable riding. She focused on the house and the garden instead, preparing for the baby's arrival with meticulous care. On a Wednesday morning in early June, Thomas was in the barn when Miguel came running in. "It's time," the foreman said. "The baby's coming." Thomas's heart leaped into his throat. They'd sent for the doctor the night before when Tabitha's pains had started, and he'd arrived just after dawn. Now Thomas rushed to the house, taking the stairs 2 at a time to the bedroom where Tabitha labored. She was pacing the room, one hand pressed to her lower back, her face pale but determined. When she saw Thomas, she managed a smile. "Took you long enough," she said, then gasped as another contraction hit. The doctor, an experienced older man who delivered half the babies in Lerdo, guided her back to the bed. "Best to save your strength, Mrs. Everett. This is going to take a while." Thomas stayed by Tabitha's side through the long hours that followed. He held her hand, wiped her forehead with cool cloths, whispered encouragement when she seemed to be faltering. The day stretched into afternoon, then evening, and Thomas's fear grew with each passing hour. "This is taking too long," he said to the doctor at one point. "First babies often do," the doctor replied calmly. "She's doing fine, strong as an ox. The baby's heartbeat is good, just needs time." Finally, as the sun was setting and painting the sky in shades of red and gold, Tabitha gave one last tremendous push, and their son came into the world, announcing his arrival with a lusty cry that filled the room. Thomas stared at the tiny, red-faced creature in the doctor's hands, unable to process that this was his child, his son. The doctor cleaned the baby quickly and wrapped him in a soft blanket, then placed him in Tabitha's arms. She looked down at the baby with wonder on her face, then up at Thomas with tears streaming down her cheeks. "Look what we made," she whispered. Thomas knelt beside the bed, looking at his wife and son, and felt something break open in his chest. He'd thought he'd lost his chance at this, at family, at legacy. But here it was, squirming and crying and absolutely perfect. "He's beautiful," Thomas said, his voice rough with emotion. "Just like his mother." "He has your eyes," Tabitha said, though Thomas thought all newborns looked pretty much the same. The baby quieted, looking around with unfocused eyes, one tiny fist waving in the air. Thomas reached out a finger and the baby's hand closed around it with surprising strength. "Hello, son," Thomas said softly. "Welcome to the world." They named him Samuel Thomas Everett after both their fathers. Sam, as they immediately started calling him, was a healthy, hungry baby with a surprisingly loud cry for such a small person. Those first weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and constant feedings, of learning to change diapers and interpret different types of cries. Thomas discovered he loved being a father in a way he'd never anticipated. He'd rock Sam for hours, singing old songs he remembered from his own childhood, marveling at the tiny perfection of his son's fingers and toes. When Sam smiled for the first time at 6 weeks old, Thomas felt his heart nearly burst with joy. Tabitha recovered well from the birth, though she was tired more than she'd admit. Thomas insisted she rest when she could, taking over Sam's care whenever possible while also managing the ranch. It was exhausting, but it was the best kind of exhaustion, born of love and purpose rather than grief and obligation. Chester took to his role as guardian of the newest member of his herd with typical goat seriousness. He'd lie outside the nursery door at night, and if Sam cried, Chester would bleat until someone came to attend to the baby. When Tabitha took Sam outside for fresh air, Chester would patrol around them, ever vigilant for snakes or other threats. "I think Chester believes Sam is his baby," Tabitha said one afternoon, watching the goat watch the baby with intense concentration. "Maybe he is, in a way," Thomas said, pulling his wife close. "This whole family exists because Chester urinated on my boot and made me laugh. We should put that in Sam's baby book. You exist because of goat pee." Thomas laughed, the sound coming easily now, natural as breathing. He'd laughed so much in the past year, more than in all the years before combined. Life had given him a second chance, and he was determined not to waste a moment of it. As Sam grew from infant to baby to toddler, the ranch continued to prosper. Thomas and Tabitha proved to be excellent business partners as well as life partners, each bringing different strengths to the operation. Thomas had the experience and the connections, while Tabitha had fresh ideas and a willingness to try new approaches. They expanded the herd, improved the breeding stock, and invested in better equipment. The Everett Ranch became known throughout southern Texas as one of the best-run operations in the region, and other ranchers started coming to Thomas for advice. But the ranch's success, while satisfying, was secondary to the richness of their family life. Thomas loved watching Sam grow, loved teaching him about cattle and horses, loved the wonder in his son's eyes when he discovered something new. Sam was fearless, probably from spending so much time around Chester, and had his mother's stubborn determination combined with his father's quiet strength. When Sam was 3 years old, Tabitha told Thomas she was pregnant again. This time, the news came with less fear and more joy. They knew what to expect now, knew they could handle whatever came. Their daughter was born on a cool October morning, arriving much faster than Sam had, as if she was in a hurry to join the party. They named her Emma Sarah Everett, honoring both Tabitha's mother and Thomas's first wife. Thomas held his daughter in his arms and felt the last remnants of guilt and grief finally release their hold on his heart. Sarah would always be part of his story, always loved and remembered, but he understood now that loving her didn't mean he couldn't love others, couldn't build a new family, couldn't embrace the life he'd been given. "Thank you," he whispered to Tabitha as she rested after the birth. "For what?" "For being stubborn enough to show up at my ranch with a goat, for refusing to give up on me, for giving me a reason to laugh again, for all of this." Tabitha reached up and pulled him down for a kiss. "Thank you for letting me in, for taking a chance on us, for being the man I knew you could be." As the years passed, the Everett family grew and thrived. Sam and Emma were eventually joined by 2 more brothers, twins that arrived when Emma was 4 and kept everyone on their toes with their mischievous antics. The house that had once been so silent and empty was now full of laughter and noise and life. Chester lived to the impressive age of 15, still occasionally escaping from enclosures and causing chaos right up until the end. When he finally passed away peacefully in his sleep, the whole family mourned him. They buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch with a marker that read, "Chester, faithful friend and guardian, he knew his herd." Thomas commissioned a painting from an artist in San Antonio, a large canvas that showed Chester standing proudly on the ranch, the house in the background. It hung in the main room of the house, a reminder of the goat who'd changed everything. On their 10th anniversary, Thomas and Tabitha took a rare evening to themselves, sitting on the porch as the sun set over land they'd built together. The children were with Miguel and his wife, giving them some privacy. "You ever regret it?" Tabitha asked, her hand in his. "Marrying me, starting over." Thomas looked at his wife, at the silver threads beginning to show in her dark hair, at the laugh lines around her eyes, at the strength and beauty that had only deepened with time. "Never," he said firmly. "Not for a single moment. You gave me back my life, Tabitha. You and that ridiculous goat." "He was a good goat," Tabitha said, smiling. "The best goat. Terrible boundaries, but the best." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the stars come out. Thomas thought about the journey that had brought them here, from that first day when Chester had marked him as part of the herd to this moment. 10 years of marriage and 4 children, and a life richer than he'd ever imagined possible. "I love you," he said, the words as true now as the first time he'd spoken them. "I love you too," Tabitha replied. "Always have, always will." Inside the house, they could hear the sounds of their children returning, laughing and chattering as Miguel's wife herded them toward the door. In a moment, the peace would be broken, replaced by the joyful chaos of bedtime routines and goodnight kisses. But for now, Thomas held his wife's hand and felt grateful for every moment, every choice, every twist of fate that had led him here. He'd lost Sarah, and that grief would always be part of him, a scar that had healed but would never fully disappear. But he'd also found Tabitha, found love again when he'd thought it impossible, found a second chance at happiness. Life, he'd learned, wasn't about choosing between past and present, between grief and joy. It was about holding space for both, about honoring what had been while embracing what was. It was about laughing at stubborn goats and taking chances on unexpected visitors, and believing that even in the darkest moments, there was still light to be found. The children burst through the door, Sam carrying Emma on his shoulders while the twins raced around them. They surrounded Thomas and Tabitha on the porch, all talking at once, full of stories about their evening. Thomas gathered them close, Tabitha beside him, and looked at his family, his real, tangible, present family, and knew with absolute certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The brooding cowboy rancher who hadn't laughed in 3 years was gone, replaced by a man who laughed every day, who loved deeply and openly, who understood that the heart was capable of infinite expansion. He'd been broken and had healed. He'd been lost and had been found. And it had all started with a woman, a goat, and a moment of unexpected laughter on a hot Texas morning. As they herded the children inside for bed, Thomas caught Tabitha's eye and smiled. She smiled back, and in that exchange was everything: love, gratitude, partnership, and the promise of all the years still to come. The ranch would continue to thrive. Their children would grow up strong and capable, ready to take on the world. And Thomas and Tabitha would grow old together, building a legacy not just of land and cattle, but of love and resilience and the courage to begin again. It wasn't the story Thomas had thought he'd have when he buried Sarah all those years ago. But it was a good story, a true story, and it was his. And that was more than enough. Years continued to roll by like tumbleweeds across the Texas prairie, each one bringing its own mixture of challenges and blessings. The Everett Ranch expanded even further as Sam grew old enough to take on real responsibilities, showing an aptitude for ranching that made Thomas's chest swell with pride. The boy had inherited his father's steady temperament and his mother's innovative thinking, a combination that served him well. Emma proved to be a natural with horses, able to gentle even the most skittish animals with patience and soft words. She reminded Thomas so much of Sarah in those moments, though she looked like Tabitha, and he found he could think of his first wife now without the crushing weight of grief, just a gentle fondness for what had been. The twins, Nathan and James, were whirlwinds of energy who kept everyone on their toes. They were 12 now, constantly competing with each other but fiercely loyal when anyone else tried to come between them. They'd inherited their mother's stubborn streak and their father's dry sense of humor, a combination that led to constant mischief, but also fierce determination when faced with challenges. Thomas was 46 now, and while his dark hair showed more gray than it once had, he felt more alive than he had at 20. His body ached more after long days of hard work, but those aches felt earned, felt purposeful. He'd built something real here, something lasting. Tabitha had turned 38 in the spring, still as beautiful to Thomas as the day she'd shown up with Chester. She'd grown into her role as ranch co-owner with grace and intelligence, earning the respect of everyone who worked for them. She still cooked breakfast most mornings, though now the children helped, and the kitchen was always full of warmth and laughter. One evening in late summer, the whole family gathered on the porch after supper. It had become a tradition over the years, this quiet time together before the children scattered to their various evening activities. Thomas sat in his favorite chair, Tabitha beside him, while the children sprawled on the steps and porch rail. "Tell us about Chester again," Emma asked, as she often did. Thomas smiled. It was her favorite story, this tale of how their family had really begun. "Chester was the most stubborn goat in the entire state of Texas," he began, as he always did. "The day your mother showed up here, looking for work, that goat took one look at me and decided I needed to be put in my place. And he peed on Papa's boot," Nathan chimed in, dissolving into giggles. "That he did," Thomas confirmed, "and I laughed for the first time in 3 years. Your mother says it was Chester who saved me, and maybe she's right." "He saved you from a rattlesnake too," Sam added. He'd heard these stories countless times but never seemed to tire of them. "He did. Chester appointed himself guardian of everyone on this ranch, and he took the job seriously." "I wish I could have met him," Emma said wistfully. "He would have loved you," Tabitha said softly. "He had a soft spot for anyone who needed protecting, and you were the tiniest thing when you were born." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant colors. These were the moments Thomas treasured most when his whole family was together, safe and healthy and happy. "Papa," Sam said eventually, his voice more serious than usual, "can I ask you something?" "Of course. Did you ever feel guilty about being happy again after your first wife died?" Thomas looked at his eldest son, nearly grown now at 16, and saw genuine curiosity rather than judgment in his eyes. It was a fair question, one Thomas had asked himself countless times over the years. "Yes," he answered honestly. "For a long time I felt like being happy meant betraying Sarah's memory, like if I moved on it meant what we had wasn't important. But you figured out that wasn't true," Sam said. "Your mother helped me understand that the heart doesn't have a limited capacity for love. Loving her didn't diminish what I felt for Sarah. It was different but equally real. And I think Sarah would have wanted me to be happy, would have wanted all of this for me." He gestured to encompass his family, the ranch, the life they'd built. "You talk about her sometimes," Emma observed, "like she's still part of the family." "She is, in a way," Tabitha said. "She helped make your father who he is and who he has made you. So she's part of your story too, even though you never knew her." Thomas reached over and took Tabitha's hand, squeezing it in gratitude. This was what he loved most about her, this generosity of spirit that allowed space for his past while building their present. "Are you going to get married, Sam?" James asked, always practical. Sam's ears turned red. "I'm only 16. "But there's that girl in town you're always staring at," Nathan added helpfully. "The one from the mercantile." "I am not staring at anyone," Sam protested, but his blush deepened. Thomas and Tabitha exchanged amused glances. They'd noticed their son's interest in the shopkeeper's daughter, a pretty girl named Margaret with dark curls and a quick smile. Young love was beginning to bloom, as it always did. "When you do decide to court someone," Thomas said seriously, "remember that marriage is work. Good work, worthwhile work, but work nonetheless. It's choosing each other every day, even when things are hard. It's being partners in the truest sense." "Like you and Mama," Emma said. "Like us," Tabitha agreed. "We don't always agree on everything, and we've had our share of arguments over the years, but we're always on the same side, always working toward the same goals." "What do you argue about?" Nathan asked curiously. "Whether to expand the North pasture or invest in more breeding stock," Thomas said. "How to handle problems with the hands. What punishment is appropriate when certain twins sneak out to go fishing when they're supposed to be doing chores." The twins had the grace to look sheepish. "But those are just details," Tabitha added. "The important things we've always been united on. Family first always. Treat people fairly. Build something worth passing on to the next generation." As the sky darkened and stars began to emerge, the children eventually drifted off to their various activities. Sam headed to the barn to check on a sick calf. Emma went inside to practice the piano that Thomas had bought her last Christmas, transported all the way from San Antonio at great expense. The twins disappeared in the direction of the creek, supposedly to check fishing lines but probably to catch frogs. Thomas and Tabitha remained on the porch, savoring the quiet. "You think we're doing it right?" Tabitha asked. "Raising them?" "I think they're turning out pretty well," Thomas said. "They're good kids, kind, hardworking, curious about the world. That's all we can really hope for." "Sam's going to want to bring that girl around eventually," Tabitha observed. "I know. And we'll welcome her, same as we'd welcome anyone our children choose to love, as long as they treat them right." "When did we get old enough to have a son who's thinking about courting?" Tabitha wondered. "I'm not sure. Seems like just yesterday you showed up here looking for work." 14 years ago, Tabitha said softly. "Sometimes it feels like forever, and sometimes it feels like no time at all." Thomas pulled her close, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They'd sat like this countless times over the years, in joy and in sorrow, in easy times and hard ones. This was home, not just the physical place but this connection between them, this partnership that had sustained them through everything. "I'm glad Chester peed on your boot," Tabitha said after a while. Thomas laughed, the sound warm and genuine. "So am I. Best thing that ever happened to me, that goat marking me as his territory." "Second best," Tabitha corrected. "The best thing was you deciding to take a chance on us." "No," Thomas said firmly. "The best thing was you being brave enough to ask for that chance. You saved my life, Tabitha. I was drowning in grief and you threw me a rope. We saved each other," she said. "I was lost too, remember? No family, no home, no prospects. You gave me all of that. We built it together." "Yes," she agreed. "Together." They sat in the darkness, listening to Emma's piano playing drift through the open windows, to the distant sounds of cattle and the chirping of crickets, to the life they'd created together in all its messy, beautiful reality. Time continued its relentless forward march. Sam did eventually court the shopkeeper's daughter, and they married when he was 22 and she was 20. Thomas and Tabitha welcomed Margaret into the family with open arms, and she proved to be a perfect match for their steady, serious son. She was practical and kind, with a good head for business that Sam appreciated. When their first grandchild was born, a boy they named Thomas Samuel Everett, Thomas held the tiny infant and marveled at the continuation of life, at the way love multiplied across generations. He was a grandfather now, a concept that seemed impossible and yet perfectly natural all at once. Emma married a neighboring rancher's son when she was 23, a good man who loved horses as much as she did. They settled on land adjacent to the Everett Ranch, building their own spread while remaining close to family. Thomas walked his daughter down the aisle with tears in his eyes, remembering the tiny baby she'd been, how he'd paced the floor with her at night when she couldn't sleep. The twins both stayed on the ranch, neither one interested in marrying young. They were partners in everything, running the day-to-day operations with increasing independence as Thomas began to step back, letting the next generation take over. Thomas was 55 when he realized he was ready to retire from the hardest physical labor. His body, while still strong, couldn't do what it once had, but he found he didn't mind. He'd earned his rest, and there was satisfaction in watching his sons run the ranch with the same dedication he'd once brought to it. He and Tabitha spent more time together, taking rides across the ranch just to enjoy the land, tending a larger garden than they needed just because Tabitha enjoyed it, sitting on the porch and watching their grandchildren play in the yard. "We did good," Tabitha said one evening, watching Sam teaching his son to ride a pony in the corral. "We did," Thomas agreed. "Built something real, something lasting. Do you ever wish things had been different, that Sarah had lived, that you'd had this life with her?" It was a question Tabitha had never asked before, and Thomas considered it carefully before answering. "I can't wish she hadn't died without wishing away everything that came after, including you and our children and grandchildren. What I wish is that the world was kinder, that good people didn't die senselessly, that grief wasn't something anyone had to carry. But I can't change the past, and honestly, I wouldn't want to change what we've built. This life right here, it's exactly what I was meant to have. Even though it took tragedy to get here, even though. I'm not glad Sarah died, and I'll always carry a scar from that loss, but I'm grateful for what grew from that scar. I'm grateful for you, for our family, for every single day we've had together." Tabitha wiped at her eyes. "I love you, Thomas Everett." "I love you too, Tabitha Everett, more than I ever thought possible." As the sun set on another day in Texas, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple, Thomas felt a deep sense of peace settle over him. He'd lived a full life, had loved and been loved, had built something meaningful that would outlast him. The brooding cowboy who hadn't laughed in 3 years was a distant memory now, someone he barely recognized. That man had been trapped in his grief, unable to see beyond his loss. But he'd been saved by a stubborn woman with a stubborn goat, and in being saved, he'd learned to live again. Life, Thomas had discovered, was resilient in ways he'd never imagined. It could be beaten down, torn apart, left for dead, and yet still find a way to grow back, to bloom again in unexpected places. Like the wildflowers that carpeted the prairie after rain, beauty could emerge from harsh conditions if given half a chance. He'd taken that chance with Tabitha, had opened his battered heart to the possibility of love again, and it had made all the difference. Now, surrounded by the evidence of that choice in children and grandchildren, in a thriving ranch and a happy marriage, in laughter and love, and the simple pleasures of a life well lived, Thomas knew he'd made the right decision all those years ago when he'd hired the woman with the goat. She'd brought more than just capable hands to his ranch. She'd brought life itself, in all its chaotic, beautiful, heartbreaking, joyful glory. And for that, he would be grateful every single day he had left on this earth. The stars came out one by one, the same stars that had witnessed his greatest sorrows and his greatest joys. Thomas took Tabitha's hand, and together they walked inside to join their family for dinner, grateful for the meal, for the company, for the love that filled every corner of their home. It was a good life, built on the foundation of second chances and stubborn goats and the courage to laugh again. And it was enough, more than enough. It was everything,